All right, welcome everyone to this week's iteration of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm your host for this session, Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I co-host this seminar series with my Vanderbilt colleague, Cassie Dorff. If you're tuning in for the first time, it'll tell you a little bit about the Colloquium. We're an online seminar series that's affiliated with the Peace Science Society International. And so our goal is to bring the great research that happens at each year's annual meeting of the Society to all of you in your homes, wherever you are around the world, year round. So today we've got kind of a special lineup. So we've actually got a double header today. So Cassie is going to be having a second session at 2 p.m. But for this morning session, we have a really great paper that I'm excited to hear the discussion about by Genevieve Bates. We also have one of her co-authors on the paper, Monika Nalepa here, and it's also co-authored with Ben Constant and Jordi Vasquez. The paper is entitled Transitional Justice Against Agents of Repression and the Threat of Regime Change. So the ground rules are pretty simple. Genevieve is going to give us a quick 15-minute presentation overview of the work, and then we're going to turn it over and have some discussant comments from our wonderful panel of discussants. We've got this week we're joined by Alyssa Prorok, who's at the University of Illinois, Cyanne Loyle at Penn State, and Geoff Dancy, who's at Tulane. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Genevieve. You can share your screen and we'll get going with the presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Brad.
Also, if everyone else could mute your mics while Genevieve gives her presentation, that's useful.
Can I just get a nod of heads that everyone can see that? Okay, great. Thanks so much for having us here today. We're really excited to talk about this paper. So the general question sort of motivating the project is, how does criminal transitional justice affect democratic stability? So I'll talk a little bit about the motivation and then take you through a series of formal models that we use to help theorize what we're thinking before providing some preliminary empirical results and concluding. But first, what is transitional justice? So transitional justice, as broadly understood, focuses on three major things: holding those who've committed atrocities accountable for their actions, ensuring justice to victims, and providing the reforms necessary to guarantee the non-repetition of abuses. For our purposes, though, we focus on the first category of transitional justice, or TJ, accountability for perpetrators. And we narrow in particular on criminal accountability for past offenses. As such, we think there's a key distinction in how transitional justice is carried out. There's transitional justice that targets the order givers or the top leaders of repressive regimes, and transitional justice that targets the order takers or the rank and file members of the regime. We think of transitional justice as sort of influencing what we're calling a balancing act. So there are two major arguments about what TJ can do in this context. On one hand, it can disincentivize repression under autocracy by raising the ex-ante costs of committing abuses. On the other hand, it can provide sort of instability under democracy by creating an incentive for former authoritarian agents to engage in coup attempts. And we can see this second argument using an example from Argentina. So in Argentina, after the failure of the military junta and the transition to democracy, President Alfonsín decreed that low-level military officers should be prosecuted for their crimes. Outrage about this policy united the previously fractured military behind an anti-TJ agenda. And in response, a part of the military, led by several mid-level officers, revolted and demanded a halt to all TJ processes. In response to that coup threat, the administration passed a full-scale amnesty, halting all criminal trials for past abuses for decades. In order to account for this sort of balancing act that we're talking about, we need a formal model. So we build on the formal theoretical literature on the relationship between authoritarian leadership, and their agents of repression. That literature has argued that TJ can affect whether agents are willing to carry out orders, and also whether or not leaders can help to counteract any effects of TJ by essentially paying their agents to repress. So we have two formal models. And the structure of the first model, the baseline, is as follows. There are two players, a leader and his repressive agent. In the first stage of the game, the leader determines whether or not to issue the order to repress. In the second stage, he then decides, if he's chosen to repress, what level he's willing to compensate his repressive agents in order to encourage them to engage in repression. In the third stage, the agent sees that compensation offer and decides whether or not to carry out the order. In the fourth stage, if they've carried out the order of repression, then with some probability, calling it probability gamma, that repression works and the regime stays in power. But with probability 1 minus gamma, the repression fails and democratization ensues. That can then lead to our fifth stage of the game, where transitional justice is implemented against the leader with certainty, but with some probability, epsilon. It's also implemented against the repressive agent. If at any point in the game repression does not occur, so either because the leader chooses not to repress at the beginning, or because the agent chooses not to follow the order after it's given, then the regime falls, but no transitional justice is implemented because no repression occurred. The key results of this baseline model is that there's a unique equilibrium in which the leader offers enough to the agent that the agent chooses to repress. Importantly, as that parameter epsilon that I talked about, which is the probability that transitional justice targets the agent of repression in addition to the leader, increases, the likelihood of this equilibrium existing decreases. So this is, again, the threat of transitional justice increasing may decrease the probability of repression occurring. But as the parameter that we have is P, which is the value of staying in power to the leader, increases, so does the likelihood that this equilibrium exists. But taking into consideration the Argentina example, we know it's possible that agents won't always just allow transitional justice to happen after a transition to democracy has occurred. So we extend the model in two ways. First, we allow transitional justice to actually be a strategic choice by democratic elites. And second, we allow for the possibility of authoritarian reversion. So we allow for this sort of coup dynamic to be possible. The setup of this new game is as follows. There are three players in this game: the authoritarian leader, his repressive agents, and now a third player who's the democratic elites. So these are the people who take over after a transition to democracy. And then there are four states of the world. The first is an authoritarian regime under the threat of revolt. This is basically the beginning of that baseline model. We're just like in an authoritarian regime facing the possibility of a transition. The second state of the world is a democratic regime without transitional justice, basically following a peaceful transition of power. So this is in line with the leader choosing not to repress in that baseline model. The third is a democratic regime embarking on transitional justice. So this would be after repression has occurred, but that repression has failed. And the third is a democratic, and the fourth is a democratic regime following a suppressed potential coup. And so this fourth stage of the world is basically accounting for the fact that repressive agents may decide to engage in a coup, but they may not always succeed. This allows us to capture everything that was in the baseline model that I just presented, but now allows for, again, democratic authoritarian reversion, which occurs when we move from state 3, democracy with transitional justice, back to state 1, an authoritarian regime. The main takeaway from the results of this extension is that widespread prosecutions against the rank and file agents of repression make democracy less appealing to these agents, and thus increase the likelihood of them joining a coup attempt. The rank and file agents joining this attempt in turn increases the chances of the coup attempt succeeding. And it leads to a few natural hypotheses. The first is that as the severity of transitional justice against the rank and file members of an authoritarian regime increases, the chances of a successful military coup increase as well. And the second is that an increase in military strength be associated with more coup attempts and a higher percentage of those attempts being successful. So we try to get at some preliminary empirical analysis in two ways. First, we take as our dependent variable data from Powell's data set on coup attempts, and we suggest two things. One, that those coup attempts which are successful are those that have the support of the rank and file members of the former authoritarian regime, and those that are failed are those with no support of the rank and file. This is because while leaders may begin coup attempts, they actually need support for them to work. For our independent variables, we have two sets of variables. First, we try to capture military strength by measuring military expenditures as a percentage of GDP. And second, and arguably most importantly, we have this variable trying to get at transitional justice prosecutions. And we use data from the Global Transitional Justice dataset to try to construct a measure of the severity of transitional justice. So this dataset collects new data on criminal prosecution events. It disaggregates those events by positive trial events. So think indictments, arrests, convictions, things like that, and negative trial events, things like amnesty policies, but also acquittals, appeals by defendants, etc. And importantly for us, this data also disaggregates by transitional justice that's targeting the leadership of a former authoritarian regime and transitional justice that is targeting the rank and file members of the former authoritarian regime. And we use this data to collect or to calculate a measure of severity of transitional justice for each of those two groups. Now, using those two measures of severity of transitional justice, we create a variable which we are calling the annual relative severity of transitional justice. And what this means is it's the severity of transitional justice against the rank and file members of the former regime over the severity of transitional justice against the former leaders of the regime, plus the severity of transitional justice against the former rank and file, actually +1 to make sure that if all of those things are zero, then what we're getting is zeros in the data. We run a series of linear probability models and are presenting some very preliminary statistical results here. And what we find is that an increase in the relative severity of TJ, which is again, severity that is increasingly targeting the rank and file members of the former authoritarian regime relative to the leadership, increases the probability of a successful coup. It doesn't have any effect on the probability of a failed coup though, which is in line with what we would think. Other variables though are not significant, and that includes our measure of military strength, which calls into question the second hypothesis. And this is true regardless of the type of regime that existed prior to the democratic transition. We think that this is convincing preliminary evidence, but we also thought it would be really interesting to look at an actual illustration. So we think Egypt is a really convincing illustration. In 2011, the Arab Spring protests toppled the near 30-year regime of Hosni Mubarak. A transitional government was put in place prior to the 2012 elections. This transitional government primarily targeted the leadership of the former regime for transitional justice, and that includes criminal trials actually against Mubarak himself. But after the 2012 elections, and in part to actually curb the strength of the military, the government, the Morsi government, began implementing through more widespread criminal trials And an example of this is that a police sniper was convicted for shooting at protesters during the revolution and was then sentenced to 5 years in prison. Only 4 months after this, the military staged a coup, which was ultimately successful. Now, the prosecutions of low-level members of the military are not explicitly cited as a cause of the coup, but we think this might be because oftentimes when coups occur, there's a big focus on the leaders who have actually organized the coup rather than the rank and file people who supported it. So to quickly wrap up, in the paper, we try to reconcile contrasting arguments about whether or not the agents of repression should be punished. One argument is that they should be targeted, in part to deter the commission of atrocities under autocracy. And the second argument is that they shouldn't, basically because it can deter coup attempts under democracy. The formal model that we present in the paper actually allows us to account for both of those things at the same time and has pretty important implications. The most important, at least in our opinion, is that new democratic elites should always, in some ways, we should expect them to always moderate their implementation of transitional justice, even if this leads to dissatisfaction. So while oftentimes there are complaints about transitional justice not going far enough to target those who've committed atrocities, that may actually make sense when you're trying to play this balancing game. So thanks so much, and I'm really excited to hear what everybody has to say. And I'm gonna stop my screen share now.
Awesome. Thanks, Genevieve. So before I turn it over to the panelists, if Genevieve and Monika, if you could give like just a few words about like where the paper is, kind of like what kind of feedback you're looking for, just to help frame the discussion, that's always useful.
Yeah, so the paper has, I'll start. Is that okay?
Yeah, oh, please do.
So the paper hasn't been submitted anywhere yet. It's been presented only once at APSA, and we actually were going to present it at ISA, the one that was in Hawaii where everybody had attached vacations to. So two of the undergraduates who we recruited to help work on the paper were actually supposed to go to Hawaii, and like now that those plans are canceled, like any conference plans are canceled. So I feel compelled to send this paper out sort of like on the quicker side so that, you know, they can at least have like a publication to help them get into graduate school. And I realized that maybe publication in Political Science Journal, Hawaii on the other side, like maybe they don't quite compare, but so I guess the kind of feedback that we're looking for is, you know, like what are the the things to make especially the empirics tie with the theory. So I will say that I'm quite happy with the theoretical model, but I think that, you know, the number of cases that we have in the large N, you know, that's why we sort of like have this Egypt case study tagged on. So we sort of like don't know where to go with the empirics. And I'll just add that it's not that, even though I am happy with the theory, it's not strong enough to be a standalone game theory paper. I mean, not strong enough. It's not sophisticated enough. So it will have to be ITM. That's where I see it. Jen, do you want to add to it?
I think that's true. Some of it is also, we're still in the process of finalizing data collection on criminal trials. So we're collecting this data on criminal trial events targeting the leadership and rank and file of former authoritarian regimes. And so as we're thinking about where to go empirically, we have a little bit of time, in part because we're finalizing the data collection.
And there are some the countries that are still outstanding are of course those that have had like very, very, very long post-transition trajectories. I will also say that we have a guess that the very idea actually of collecting event-based data on criminal trials was suggested to us by one of the reviewers on our Perspectives article, and we have a strong suspicion that one of the people who suggested that is among the panelists, and we wanted to say thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, that's
We'll turn it over to the panelists now. So Geoff, if you want to get us kicked off with some comments.
I'll get cranked up. Thanks everybody for inviting me. I'm excited to see this because I think we've all here done evidence-based research on transitional justice, and this is a new data set. And having worked on a data set and continuing to work on one that collects similar data, I'm actually excited about it, and I want to talk to you. I haven't had a chance yet to talk to you about your data collection efforts, and I don't feel competitive at all, except for the name of it, which is the Global Transitional Justice Database, which is really similar to the acronym is similar to my initials. It's yours the GTJD, and my name is Jeffrey Thomas Dancy, which is the GTD. So that makes me feel like a failure in branding. I named my data set something stupid. But I should start by saying that I have no doubt that this piece is going to be published in a top journal. And the level of erudition and sophistication that's evident in it is impressive to me, and I could never achieve this level of sophistication with the formal modeling. And I know that this is kind of at the early stage of the empirics, but I am going to focus on the empirical elements because what really did kind of stand out to me. This paper made me start thinking about the nature of positivist social science, and so I don't want to be too much of like kind of a dinosaur and talk about positivism, but I'm going to. So I myself positivist, and by that I mean I put a great deal of emphasis on observable facts. I suspect that the authors also identify as positivists. I know you. I think that you're positivist, and you engage in formal theory, which at times has been itself called positivist political theory or logical positivism. This kind of positivism is somewhat distinct from my brand because it places a great deal of emphasis on logical deduction, whereas my brand is more about learning from the data we're handed by the world. So I think of it as slightly different, though we aim at the same thing. What's my point? For me, this piece is a little too heavy with the positivism of the logical variety and a little too light of the positivism of my variety, the evidence-based theory. So being a positivist obsessed with observables, I would have to see a great deal more evidence before I'm convinced by this argument, or that I think that this argument's true. And because I know that this is early on, I'll just, in the project, I'll just kind of list the questions that I had when I read it, which is, one, how many trials are there in the countries that you observe, and how did you collect these data? And how, and second, what proportion of trials on average target low-ranking members of military or security forces? You claim that this is actually rarer than trials that target high-ranking elites, but based on my experience with the data, that's actually not true. A third question I have is, in how many transition countries are trials followed by a successful coup? I just want to know that descriptive information. How many times you observe these trials, then also observe a coup? Fourth, how many of these instances are coups initiated by military brass or elites or leaders, however we would characterize them? And fifth, how many countries that experience a coup have a history of coups? Oftentimes with coups, we see repeated coups. Coups are something that are patterned and that trend over time. So this brings second big issue, the theory of coups. I'm not an expert on this, but coups do seem to be a plausible and straightforward indicator of democratic instability. So I think it's a good choice for your argument. However, articles like Albrecht and Eibel, which was a 2018 piece in ISQ, make a critical distinction between coups led by military elites and coups led by combat officers. They show that military spending decreases the elite variety of coups, the elite-led coups, while social spending decreases soldier-led coups. I may have missed something in the formal theory, but I think that you basically conflate these types of coups into one type, assuming that all coups are led by military elites, and then soldiers just decide whether or not to join them. But I'm not sure that this assumption is really valid based on empirical evidence. This raises a third issue for me, which is the conceptualization of rank and file criminal justice. I wonder why rank and file members care that they're being prosecuted relative to military elites. The measure is relative severity of rank and file justice. So in the model, elites are the ones who initiate coups and the rank and file join them. But if they're a country, so if they're a country with a very high relative severity score of say 1, it would mean that all prosecutions were of rank and file forces and no trials were of elites. According to your model, this scenario is for a coup. But my question is, why would elites initiate a coup in this scenario? They're not being punished at all. Why do they care if everyday soldiers or even police forces are being prosecuted by the new regime if it doesn't affect their lives? So you're assuming there's some kind of loyalty, I think, that the very elites have to the rank and file members. This brings me to a fourth point, which is that I'm generally skeptical that rank and file trials lead to coups in new democracies. I'm not closed off to the idea. I'm skeptical. And I think that there might be alternate causality. I would bet my membership in peace science, if I were a member, I'm actually not a member, that if the authors modeled or controlled for previous coups in the country and previous levels of repression, that there would be no observable relationship between trials and coups. Why? Because trials aren't what cause coups. It's lack of functioning institutions and continued instability in a country. Think riots, protests, violent repression, protest repression cycles that lead to coups. My point is that the existence of trials and the initiation of coups are likely endogenous to other factors, which brings me to my final point. I know I'm going quickly. I have all this written down. I'll send it to you. My final point is that the authors align their work with Snyder and Venjamuri, who have repeatedly questioned the positive impact of human rights prosecutions on the basis of arguments about selection. This paper, like Snyder and Venjamuri, claim that trials may have unintended negative consequences, so states should instead resort to other mechanisms like amnesties or truth commissions. But it seems like work that finds criminal prosecutions have a negative effect don't always go to equal lengths to account for selection effects. So in this paper, the main independent variable is prosecution of rank and file agents of violence. But why are some countries more prone to conduct these trials? Why do some countries have more rank and file trials than other countries? This isn't, I don't think, yet addressed in the article, and it's a really important point because of this. And this is where I'll end. I suspect that rank and file trials are the new democratic regime's response to a history of agency loss in police and security forces. So the state isn't strong enough to ensure that agents of violence refrain from costly and unpopular repressive violence. So new democratic regimes do their best to rein them in with prosecutions, which just leads to more insubordination and unruliness among security forces. In short, trials and coups might be caused by a third factor, which is weak centralized states that can't solve their own principal agent problem. If this is true, the paper has selection issues that can't be solved with the methods currently employed, but it also has theoretical problems, because as it stands, the formal model assumes that repression is decided and ordered, when in fact it might just be evidence of a lack of control. The central government can't control its agents of violence. If that's the case, then there's a misalignment between the logic of the formal model and real-world empirics. And this brings me back to unobservables. The article's formal model of orderly repression and my kind of just tossed out alternative model of disorderly repression are both plausible explanations of an observed relationship between rank and file trials and coups. But by what criteria would we judge which is the better explanation? The only way to know, I think, is not to resort to the internal logic of the formal models, but to examine additional facts in the real world. And that's ultimately what I would like the authors to do. End.
Right.
All those along. I'm sorry, I read through them quite fast.
So thanks. Do we respond?
Yeah, so you can respond. We can do it either way you'd like. So you can respond to each individually, or we can download the comments from Cyanne and Alyssa, and then have sort of overall response. It's up to you two.
Yeah, so let me respond to the questions that are easy to respond, because they simply, you know, the summary statistics that should have been provided in the paper, maybe a little bit more than summary statistics. So so there aren't many countries that have trials and have coups. Like, this is one of the reasons why we're basically wondering whether we should even have a large N study, because the results basically hinge on a few, I mean, from among the countries that we have collected data on so far, the results hinged on a few countries where this dynamic occurred. I thought that maybe this is the subsequent version to the one that we were circulated, because it's not yet complete, but I thought we were controlling for past coups. My comment on this will be, so I'm familiar with that result, but I guess as a theorist, I'm not very convinced that this logic past coups predict future coups works very well, because, you know, like, if coups occurred in the past, then, like, shouldn't you invest in more coup-proofing institutions? I think it rather has something to do with the number of institutions that have to be captured for a coup to be successful. And given that those are constant, or like more or less constant, due to like political culture legacies or something like that, if military brass have few democratic institutions to capture in order to remain in power, then that will also happen in the case of future coups. So one of the reasons why we have a smaller number of cases, if you're familiar with the coup literature, you might be like, what? Why? Is because of the limitations of what we call transitional justice, right? So in our case, in order to be considered transitional justice, you have to be a democracy, and like a solid democracy, as in not hybrid. So coups in democracies just don't happen that often, especially in solid democracies where there are lots of checks and balances. So I guess one of the things that I would do in response to this is, and I hate the measure veto players for a variety of theoretical reasons, but I wonder if instead of past coups, it would make sense just to control for veto players, which is basically a proxy for like how many democratic institutions you have to capture in order for a coup to be successful. I am new, I mean, maybe not that new, but like relatively new to the coup literature. So I was actually not aware that there are coups that are not organized by military brass. I mean, they have to participate. How would we be a coup otherwise? So, but I was not familiar with the Albrecht and Nile paper. So we will read it and try to get from it what you suggest we should be getting. And I also say that you're absolutely right. The idea is that elites organize coups, and all that the soldiers can do is just decide whether to join or not. And it's like that action of joining that determines a successful coup. So if that is too simplistic and simply, you know, not on a par with the facts, then, you know, we'll definitely think about ways to revise it. I will say that we're not assuming that elites are not punished. Elites are always punished. And here's the thing with punishing leaders. So they can also be punished through other ways, like they lose their jobs, they're purged more frequently. Leadership purges are way more frequent than thorough purges. So even if they're not immediately reached by transitional justice, there's always a sanction that they face relative to their position in the authoritarian regime. So I don't think that's like too strong of an assumption, but we basically assume like elites are always punished. And then like how many are those rank and file going to get punished? So that's where the relative severity was felt to be, we felt was justified. The other reason why we use relative is because simply like, well, what else? I mean, we're comparing different countries to each other. Some have strong judicial systems, others don't. So it seems that if we focused on absolute punishment of the rank and file, we might be picking up just this quality of their judiciaries. I wasn't, maybe Jen can help me out here. I'm not sure I quite got the response to the agency loss, because I thought that is what we were trying to model with the compensation under the authoritarian regime. So the idea of the Markov transition game was to capture both incentives for using transitional justice from the point of view of an authoritarian regime, or rather the reemergence of an authoritarian regime, and from the point of view of so I guess maybe there's like a better way to say. There are two ways in which an authoritarian regime can occur. One is through a coup out of a democracy, when you punish the agents of repression too severely. And another way an authoritarian regime can occur is when it becomes very easy for a potential autocrat to recruit agents of repression. So we were trying to get at both those things at once, and hence the idea for the MT. So the principal agent model is kind of like built in there. I mean, you could basically break down the strategic dynamics in either of those stages and show that there is that principal agent dynamic, but I'm not sure that's the one that you were looking for. Jen, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm actually really curious if once we get all the other comments, if Geoff is still going to be here, if his answer to this to this last comment that you just had, which is, I want to make sure that we understand which part of the agency loss it is that you're mentioning. Also, I know you said you're going to send us written comments, so it's fine. Also,
and thank you so much. Those were very careful and very, show in-depth reading comments. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, maybe Mom just got home, and so I'm going to stay for the rest. So.
Oh, sweet.
Awesome. Okay, so let's keep moving through the comments. I want to make sure that we get everything in. So Cyanne, if you wanna go ahead.
Sure. Well, I don't have a snazzy introduction on positivism to share with you guys, so I will jump right into it. But I will echo Geoff's comments that I thought this was a really interesting paper, and in particular, kind of thinking through the disaggregation of targets of transitional justice processes is kind of the new wave in which some of the literature is going, and you guys do it in a pretty sophisticated way. So I like thinking about the differences between rank and file and elites and some of the kind of theoretical implications, but also empirical implications that can come from that. Most of my general comments are really around setup and framing, which Monika, you mentioned would be useful as you moved forward. And it was certainly one of the things that jumped out at me. I think there's a number of places where your setup and framing in general can be much more consistent. So for example, in the intro, you talk about variations between the prosecutions of elites and rank and file. But that then goes on to not be your main argument, but rather you focus much more on the repercussions of this variation in targeting. So thinking about kind of which examples you want to do to kind of lead the reader in, I think would be really useful, because that then led me to some confusion in your modeling strategy later. I wanted to echo Geoff's point about presenting more data up front. There actually seems to be some places in the text where I think they're just typographical errors, but you go back and forth between whether or not targeting rank and file is common or not common, both in your examples and then in some of the explanations in the text. And so I wanted to see what those numbers look like, particularly because you have them from the data. So just what percentage are we actually talking about here, and what are the conditions under which we see these different things, these different patterns? And that same confusion kind of stuck with me into the presentation of the first model, of the baseline model on page 8, where you make an assumption that the order giver himself is always punished in this role. And that confused me from the intro, at least, because you seemed to lead me to believe that this was not this was not always the most common scenario. And I want you to spend a little bit more time thinking about the setup for why the first transitional justice model was needed, because I understood it much better in Genevieve's presentation than I did in the paper. So the kind of where the baseline model came from and why we needed that first step, I think that's a couple of sentences. It's not a major revision, but I didn't feel led into that very well. When you present your hypothesis, I would spend just a little bit more time talking about what leads up to a successful coup. And this involves, I think, both engaging a little bit more with the coup literature, as Geoff suggested, but also just leading the reader through your thinking on the conditions that make that success most likely. I, again, had similar comments to Geoff on the empirics in terms of the relative severity measure. I think that needs to be tied much more clearly to your argument, because it seems to kind of come out of nowhere for me. And let me just say, I love your data and I love the data project, but I wonder if this measure isn't overly complicating things here. I'd at least want to see kind of a robustness check as you move forward, using just a straight up dichotomous measure for, yes, the rank and file are prosecuted in some way, or no, they are not. And then also thinking through the extent to which some of your findings are based on this measure of TJ, as opposed to just kind of the thumbs up, thumbs down approach. I was less convinced by the Egyptian case study than I was by the Argentinian case study. And that was reaffirmed in the presentation that Genevieve just gave. Not least of all, because you come right out and say that you don't have any smoking gun information on whether or not the rank and file prosecutions really were driving anything. I think it comes across more clearly in your explanation of the Argentinian case. And depending on how the empirics go forward, I mean, so I would look either for kind of a good smoking gun quote in the Egyptian case. Now, you don't have representative survey data of what it was that the rank and file was thinking about pre-coup, and I understand that, but just to get a little bit more leverage on the fact that prosecutions were kind of moving this at all, which again, I think ties back to kind of Geoff's point of I'm not totally convinced. You're not making the assumption or even the argument that this is the entire motivation for the coup, but I'd want a little bit more kind of structure or substance to that claim, or at least talk about prosecutions in the Egyptian case in a much clearer way to kind of give the reader the idea of what was at stake for the soldiers. But overall, I mean, I think this is a really interesting paper with some great data, some great setup, and I enjoyed the models, right? Like I thought the games were interesting, and so I think it has a real future. But I would really tighten up kind of the setup and thinking through exactly how all your pieces fit together.
Thanks, Cyanne. So maybe in lieu of a response, we can go ahead and get to Alyssa's comments, just because we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure we get through everything.
But thank you, Cyanne.
Sure. So downside of going third is that the first two people have stolen all of my comments. But I think it's probably useful to hear that kind of I had a lot of the same thoughts as Geoff and Cyanne did. And so I'll just kind of briefly touch on some of them, and maybe kind of hearing it from another perspective will be helpful. So in terms of kind of like the framing of the paper and the setup of the paper, I agree fully with Cyanne that could be kind of streamlined a little bit. You go into several examples early on in the introduction that don't seem to be exactly what you want to be talking about anyway, right? So you talk about this idea of retroactivity and how it's difficult to punish the perpetrators of atrocities once you're in a democratic regime, and then that idea kind of gets dropped from the paper. And then you give examples of innocence, and then that's kind of dropped from the paper, right? And so I would just kind of come in with the Argentina example and really talk first and foremost about what it is that you really want to talk about, which is the strategic dynamic. And I think that would help clarify kind of right from the get-go what it is that your paper is really talking about. I also struggled a little bit with the way that the puzzle is set up around page 6, and it seems like there's, I guess, maybe because you're talking about it from the new democratic regime's perspective, I wasn't entirely convinced that there actually was a puzzle there. I think there is a puzzle, but I think that maybe it's more puzzling from a different actor's perspective. And so, you know, the way I was reading that, it was the agents of repression can simply choose to accept the order to repress. And because democratic leaders fear a coup, once we're in a democratic environment, they won't punish, right? And so I guess maybe clarifying that puzzle a little bit would be helpful. There were a few places in the paper where I was struggling with this idea of timing, right? So there's different stages of this model, and I was struggling to figure out, like, what does each actor know at each stage, and does the kind of threat of, or the expectation of punishment in the democratic stage, and in I think state 3 it was, is that known to the agents of repression when they're deciding whether to accept or not accept the order to repress in stage one of, or state one? And then does that expectation always bear out? Can a democratic government kind of decide not to repress, and so expectations don't necessarily match reality? I also, it kind of going along with this theme of timing, I'm wondering, like, does this game repeat over time, right? So at each stage, there is a decision to order repression or not, and then accepting or not. And do leaders and their agents kind of get locked into a repressive pattern because now they have an expectation of punishment afterwards, versus in the first state when, or in the first stage of a game, when they haven't actually engaged in repression yet, there's no expectation of punishment. So I'm kind of wondering about how time, if time plays a role at all. So a small point, you use the language of severity with regard to transitional justice and the punishment that will be faced. And I found that a little bit confusing, just as somebody who has studied severity of punishment or thought about severity of punishment. And I think we're thinking about it in different ways. So I think defining what that is, or maybe talking about it more as the probability of facing punishment rather than the severity, would help clarify that. I think that in a few ways you could kind of expand upon the contribution that you're making with this paper. And I think you could speak a little bit to the literature on authoritarian power sharing and coup risk in authoritarian states. But I think the way that you're approaching it is a little bit unique in that you're focusing on coups that occur after democratization, whereas coups generally take place before democratization happens and maybe even propel the democratization process. And so I wonder a little bit about how the model that you've produced fits in with kind of what we know about power sharing and coup risk in authoritarian regimes. I had several thoughts on the data and analysis, and Geoff touched on a lot of the similar points, so I won't go into a ton of detail. But I will echo the idea of thinking about who's actually carrying out the coup. So I was thinking of June Suduth's work. She has, I think, a 2020 paper where she looks at coups in the context of civil wars, but a similar thing where who carries out the coup matters. And so this kind of getting back to this idea of like the coup might be carried out by top brass, or it could be carried out by lower level agents. And I think that that's more what you care about than coup success, or it could be that you could measure that instead of relying on coup success as your measure. And then in reading the Egypt example, I was kind of wondering if this is maybe broader than a story about transitional justice, and it could just be a story about reforms more generally. So I was struggling a little bit to figure out kind of in all of the detail that you were giving about that case, whether all of these things were considered transitional justice, or whether some of them were just kind of general reforms that could generate a coup in and of themselves, versus transitional justice mechanisms that are generating a coup. And so I kind of wanted some more clarity on the line there, like what constitutes transitional justice and what is just a general reform, and whether it's actually the TJ measures, or whether it's some broader set of kind of disruptions and changes. And then the final point is, I think that you could also argue that this theory would travel to like a post-conflict transitional justice setting, where you have reforms of security forces and transitional justice happening post-conflict rather than post-democratization. And so I think that you could, again, kind of broaden the reach and the implications of the paper to talk about that. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alyssa. So we've got about 5 more minutes for response and discussion. So Monika and Genevieve, if you have any response you want to give to the comments, and then we can have a discussion with the time we have left.
Jen, do you want
Sure.
to?
I'll just say that so there are two things that Alyssa said that definitely were themes that came through in what Geoff and Cyanne were saying as well, that I think are really interesting, and I definitely think we should do more with them. So again, this idea of who's actually carrying out the coup. It's good to know that there's actually like data out there on who's actually pushing these coups, because I think that you're really right about thinking about maybe using that instead of coup success or failure as the outcome that we're interested in. So we'll take a look at that and we'll see what we can get there. And this question about Egypt. So is this a story about transitional justice or a story about reform more generally? I guess what I would say is that it's a story about transitional justice embedded into a broader package of reforms, which is oftentimes what we're seeing in newly democratizing countries. But how do we then disentangle what's actually the transitional justice and what's actually like all of these other things that are happening, is something that we probably should spend a little bit more time like focusing on in that case study or any other case study that we decide to add to the project. Those are my first like gut instinct responses, but I don't know if Monika wants to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, just like a very constructive response that what I'm hearing from you about the framing is to lead with Argentina and perhaps like have the Lysias and other stuff that I was so happy that I dug up while teaching on transitional justice. Maybe have that as a motivation for like how we disaggregate our criminal trials data, that there even is like a reason to disaggregate punishing rank and file and punishing leaders. But it sounds like the Argentinian case described beautifully in Carlos's Nino Transitional Justice Classic, like really makes for a better lead up. And also the extensions to conflict, definitely post-conflict settings would make sense. The limitation of our database, which, I mean, I'm not going to regret that we limited it to clear democracies to be able to implement transitional justice, because I don't think it would have been a manageable project in the 3-year time frame. But it's like now coming to haunt us. I mean, the number of times that in our labs we've had discussions about like, no, you can't count that because it was not a democracy. So like now. No,
that exact thing happened to us over and over and over, and that's why we just had to widen it to the entire world, but that has a bunch of problems too. Anyway, sorry.
So Geoff, can you just quickly clarify, and I'm sorry, maybe I was just like didn't have enough coffee in me yet, but can you repeat the agency loss comment again?
Sure. I might be wrong about that, it turns out, because I hadn't thought about the compensation bit enough, but what I'm saying, this is the kind of counter narrative that I envision, right? That you have a situation like in India is not a great example because it's not authoritarian yet, but there are police officers in India that torture to extract confessions without directives to do so. They don't take orders from anybody to do it. They just do it because it works for them. And so, and I think that happens in a number of other instances where states are weak. Haiti has a lot of repression and repressive violence that's not ordered by elites. This repeat number of other countries. So if that's the case, and then you also have prosecutions of police forces that engage in that after a new democratic regime takes over. And those low-ranking soldiers and police forces might get together and start a coup themselves. Then you've got basically an alternate path that doesn't involve elites at all. And so that's what I'm wondering about, if that's a possibility. It might be that I'm kind of concocting a fake empirical story based on cobbling together various pieces of information, but there have been cases of low-ranking soldiers that start coups in response to trials, which is something that happened in the Philippines when Corazon Aquino took over. There was talk of trials, and then there were a couple of military bases that basically organized a coup together and had very little input from the military leadership in the country. And it's because they didn't want to go on trial. The lower ranking officers and combat soldiers didn't want to go on trial. And so I think there are instances of that, though I'd have to kind of dig in a bit more. That's all that I was concerned about, that there's this possibility that it's basically a story of weak states, not strong states that decide to repress.
Great. That's very helpful. Now it's crystal clear. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, the idea of rogue agents of repression is definitely, you know, like one that I think, you know, like we have an idea. We just didn't think of it in this context. So yeah, do we have? We're out of time now, right? We've got last 2 minutes. So
we
should
bumping
just
up against the time. So, yeah,
like extensively thank everybody. And thank you, Bradley, for organizing this and sharing.
Yeah, very, very happy to do so. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Monika. Thanks, Genevieve, for the great paper. I look forward to seeing it in print. I agree with Geoff. I think it'll be published well. It's really interesting. It's awesome to see, you know, application of formal theory to this kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed reading it, really enjoyed watching the discussion. Thanks, Geoff, Cyanne, and Alyssa for the careful read of the paper and really constructive comments and discussion. So for everyone who's tuning in to this, we have, like I said, we have a double feature today. So join us again. Cassie Dorff will be hosting at 2 p.m. Central Time today, where we're going to have Matthew Simonson presenting a paper called "Shoot a Stranger, Save a Neighbor: Civilian and Combat Networks Under Fire." You should be able to find the manuscript that we discussed today on our website under the Colloquium tab. If you have comments or questions, feel free. I'm sure Monika and Genevieve would welcome any other comments as they prepare the paper for submission. So with that, I want to thank audience, thank presenters and panelists again, and until next time, we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks.
See you.